My name is Amanda Friedman, and I'm the museum's Associate Director of Education. On behalf of the museum's leadership, survivors, staff, and volunteers, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for this special program in recognition of Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Fall down 7 times, get up 8. Thank you also to our community partners for this program who were listed on the pre-roll slides. On August 9th, 1945, at the age of 9, Chiyono Shoji Hamer survived the horrors of the atomic bomb dropped over Nagasaki. Today, her daughter, Susan Woollen, shares her mother's story of resilience from the devastation of war to a new life as a Japanese war bride in the United States. Susan is an Illinois Holocaust Museum docent, a facilitator for the museum's Brill Law Enforcement Action and Democracy training, and the first member of the museum's second-generation Speakers Bureau to speak on behalf of an atomic bombing survivor. Please join me in welcoming Susan Woollen.
Thank you, Amanda, for your warm introduction. And many thanks to the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center for gifting me this time and this space to share my mother's story. And I'd also like to acknowledge all of my friends and family in the viewing audience for their love and support that has accompanied me on this journey of mine. And thanks to everyone for carving out time during your day to watch this program about my mother. And I have the privilege of speaking to you today about my mother, Chiyono Shoji Hamer. She was a survivor of the atomic bomb that was deployed over Nagasaki, Japan on August the 9th, 1945. This was the second of 2 nuclear weapons used against Japan, the first being deployed over Hiroshima on August the 6th. And even though my mother survived a weapon of mass destruction, the bomb still found a piece of her to destroy. It repressed her voice to talk about that day in August, as well as the years before and after the war. But my mother's silence is not unusual. Many atomic bomb survivors did not and do not speak of their bomb or war experiences, even within their own families. Yet my mother's silence shapes a broader narrative about the devastation that nuclear weapons pose on human beings. Now, my mother passed away in 2001, but I believe her story is as important today as it ever has been. And as her daughter, I reclaim her voice and I reclaim her witness to the horrifying effects of a nuclear weapon. There is a Japanese saying that goes like this: fall down 7 times, get up 8. And this saying speaks to my mother's resiliency, her courage, and what I call just true grit. Let me take a moment to introduce you to my mother. You're probably familiar with this image from the museum's website, but this is a picture of my mother's wedding portrait. She and my father, Herbert Hamer Jr., were married in 1955, and this painting hung in every home they lived in. Sometimes it was in the bedroom, sometimes it was in the living room. And today, this portrait, along with its companion that I'll show you momentarily, now hang in my family's living room. Now, my mother is wearing a traditional Japanese wedding kimono, and you see that there are cranes in the print. And cranes have a great deal of symbolism in Asian culture. They represent hope and luck and wisdom and peace. And you'll also notice bamboo, and the bamboo suggests strength and durability. And my mother's choice of Black material is significant as well. Black represents the bride's strong intention not to be defined by someone else. But I also want to show you some other pictures of my mother. These were taken in 1955 when she was 20 years old. Free from the constraints of the kimono, you see a different side to my mother. Like most 20-year-olds, you see someone who is eager for life. Yet, as we know, wounds and scars are not always physical, and they're not always visible. My mother's story begins in Japan, and Japan is located off of the Asian continent. Over 6,000 islands comprise Japan, and we're familiar with the four largest ones. To the north is Hokkaido. The largest one is Honshu, and that's where we would find Tokyo and Hiroshima. And then there is Shikoku, and the southernmost island is Kyushu. And it's on Kyushu where Nagasaki is located. And the city lies at the mouth of the bay where the Urakami and the Nakashima rivers flow into the East China Sea. Now, water is a symbol of life in Japan, and Nagasaki's ports and waterways provide sustenance for its residents. In the 400 years leading up to World War II, Nagasaki's ports connected Japan to Europe and Western culture. It became Japan's most international city, with traders from Britain and the Netherlands, France, Russia, the United States, and China setting up homes in the city. Now, by 1945, there were approximately 245,000 residents in Nagasaki, most of whom were women, children, and the elderly, because most young men had been called into military service. There were no paved roads, and the tallest buildings were typically no more than 3 stories high. And Nagasaki was the third largest shipbuilding city in the world. Now, Nagasaki is where my mother was born on October the 1st, 1935. And for those of you who follow the zodiac, she was pretty much every bit a Libra. And I'm going to share a little bit about her family tree because I'll be mentioning some of her family members as we move forward in her story. But her mother's name was Misao, and her father's name was Zentado. And Zentado was a fisherman farmer. And here we see Zentado with my mother around 1970. He came to visit us when we lived in Okinawa. And over his left shoulder, you see my mother's wedding portrait. Now, my mother was the oldest of 3 daughters. Her middle sister was her middle sister was Aiko. And my mother described Aiko as the smart but clever one. And her youngest sister was Amiko, Amy for short. And Amy was the sweet sister. And so my mother preferred her company over Aiko's. And here we see Amiko around 1956. Now, the matriarch of the family was Chia, pictured here in 1956. She was Zentado's mother. She was the matriarch of the family, and she lived with them in their family home. And their home was within walking distance to the city. Now, I don't know of any pictures of my grandmother Misao or my aunt Aiko, and I can't be for certain that the home that you see here is the home that they were living in during the war. And if it isn't, it would resemble their home in at least architectural style. Now, in 1926, Hirohito Michinomiya was crowned Emperor of Japan, and his reign would be known as the Showa era, or the era of enlightened peace. But there would be no enlightened peace or peace in general during this part of his reign. And that's because of the ultra-nationalist Japanese military who controlled national policy. Patriotism was mandatory and demanded complete loyalty to the emperor and to the state. The emperor was considered a direct descendant of God, and his subjects, including my mother, were not allowed to look at him directly into his eyes or to even hear his voice. And Japanese citizens were subjected to oppressive policies that restricted their freedom of speech as well as other civil liberties. This was the Japan that my mother was born into. Now, before my mother was born, Japan occupied Korea. And when she was 2 years old, Japan invaded China in 1937. By 1940, Japan's expansionism had gone as far south as French Indochina, and Japan signed a military pact with Nazi Germany and Italy, becoming an Axis power. Then on December 7th, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and the United States entered World War II. Now, by 1942, the Allies started to turn the tide of the war in the Pacific with victories at Midway, Guadalcanal, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. But Japan's propaganda machine wanted Japanese to believe Japan was winning the war. But my mother's war recollections only speak to pain, hardship, and loss. You see, Japan could no longer provide enough food for its people. Rice, which was and still is a staple of the Japanese diet, was rationed 2 cups per person per month. And my mother's family resorted to using the black market to obtain food. Now, at some point in time, my grandfather Zentaro was conscripted into the Imperial Japanese Navy. And at some point in time, the family was informed that he had been killed in action. And sometime before the end of the war, my grandmother Misao remarried. Now, I'm not sure why she remarried. It very well may have been out of love, or it may have been as a means of survival for the family. You see, Japanese soldiers were considered to be part of an elite class. And when you're part of an elite class, comes special privileges. My mother said everyone had to bow to soldiers. And if the soldiers didn't think you bowed deeply enough to them, showing them proper respect, then they would beat you. And so my mother learned that even if she saw Japanese soldiers approaching in the distance, she would immediately lie down on her stomach, put her arms out as far as she could to avoid being beaten as they passed. And in late 1944, children 14 years of age and older no longer went to school. They had to work full time to support the war effort. Now, although my mother was 9 years old, she and thousands of other school children were required to participate in combat training. Anticipating an American invasion, my mother said students were given bamboo poles to use against American soldiers. And she said every day they gathered in the schoolyard practicing lunging with these sticks, similar to what you see these women doing in the image. Now, my mother was a very pragmatic person, even at the age of 9. And she couldn't understand why anyone would think bamboo poles would work against American soldiers with machine guns. But we can understand that if we read the quote in the middle of the image: if we are prepared to sacrifice 20 million Japanese lives, victory will be ours. And so we are talking about a country that was willing to sacrifice its future in sacrificing its children. Now, my mother's lifelong fear of sirens developed because of the number of air raid sirens that were triggered by American bombers. But unlike other Japanese cities, Nagasaki had not been devastated by conventional or fire bombs. And that left Nagasaki's residents wondering, why is Nagasaki being spared? And as my mother went about her daily life, the United States government selected 4 Japanese cities for atomic bombs: Niigata to the north, Hiroshima, Kokura, and Nagasaki. Kyoto would come off of the list as it would be deemed too beautiful to be destroyed. Now, as we know, atomic bombs are not supercharged conventional weapons. They are called weapons of mass destruction because they are designed to create a nuclear reaction that destroys using intense heat and radiation. The first bomb was deployed over Hiroshima, and it instantly killed 80,000 people. Nagasaki would have been spared as the second target had Kokura not been covered by smoke from a nearby fire bombing. The second bomb used on Nagasaki contained plutonium, which was intended to be more devastating than the first bomb. And it took the 5-ton weapon 46 seconds to reach its detonation point above the city. And when it exploded at 11:02 a.m., the equivalent to 21,000 tons of TNT made the city convulse. At that moment in time, my mother was standing in the doorway of their home, and she recalled seeing that bright flash of light. And so she quickly closed the door to block it out. And following this flash of light came the intense heat and winds that annihilated everything within a mile of ground zero. People were vaporized. Over 2.5 square miles of the city was consumed by fire. 40,000 people were instantly killed. The wind sent shards of glass through the door that my mother was hiding behind. And in Japan at the time, doors weren't made out of wood. They weren't made out of metal. They were made out of paper. And coming out of their root cellar, her grandmother, Chia, was hit by flying shrapnel. And she looked up asking, where are all the airplanes? Not realizing that one plane had dropped one bomb. Now, my mother didn't share anything else from that day. The next day, she said she walked to the city in search of a friend. And what she saw must have been beyond description because she never shared with us what she witnessed. Her invisible scar would hide her invisible wound. And the effects of war and the bomb didn't end with Japan's surrender. Difficult times continued, and at least 30,000 more residents of Nagasaki would die from bomb-related injuries by the end of 1945. And there would be a near famine in Japan in 1946. Now, mostly between 1945 and 1955 is a blank page in my mother's history. She shared one story with us. Shortly after the war, my grandfather Zentado showed up at the family home. He had not been killed in action. He had been taken prisoner of war. But my grandmother Misao had remarried. So what was she to do? Divorce at the time was unheard of. So they went to the matriarch of the family, Chia, and Chia gave my grandmother Misao 2 choices. You can stay with your second husband, but you can't take your 3 children with you. Or you can go back to your first husband and remain with your 3 children. And for reasons unknown to me, my grandmother Misao left with her second husband, leaving my mother with a sense of abandonment that she felt for the rest of her life. We also know that at some point in time, my mother left Nagasaki for Tokyo, which was then a 36-hour train ride away. And this was an unusual decision for an unmarried Japanese woman. And more than likely, she moved from the stigma and discrimination of being an atomic bomb survivor. In Japan, survivors are known as hibakusha. And as a result of radiation poisoning, exposure, and/or physical scars, hibakusha were socially ostracized. And it was difficult for them to marry because of the potential for children to be born with birth defects. Now, I used to think that this was negative space because I knew so little of my mother's life at this time. And recently I learned about a Japanese concept called Ma, M-A, very short and simple. And Ma asks us to see this space in a different way. That absence isn't negative, but it suggests opportunity and possibility and creativity. So now when I enter this empty space, I see that my mother was shaping her life and giving it purpose. It was in Tokyo where she met my father, Herbert Hamer Jr. And my father was from the south side of Chicago, Illinois, graduated from Purdue University in 1954 on an ROTC scholarship. He was commissioned a second lieutenant in the United States Army, and his first duty station was in Tokyo. He and my mother met on a blind date in early 1955, and they were married later that year. Now, even though it was legal for them to marry, the United States government didn't really want them to. They didn't make the process easy. In fact, the process discouraged them from getting married. The process was long, it was laborious, and it was intrusive for a Japanese woman. And it made my father say he felt ashamed to be an American. Now, when I asked my mother how her family accepted my father, she said they loved him, right? They thought he was a good man who would take good care of her. And I believe my father exceeded her expectations. But it was a different story when I asked my mother how his parents accepted her. And she said his mother asked him, "Why couldn't you marry a nice American girl?" right in front of my mother. Now, American was code for white. You see, my grandmother Hamer immigrated from Germany in 1912, so my mother's citizenship status had very little to do with her opinion of my mother. But here you see my father with his father-in-law, Zentato, and then Zentato's brother, and then my oldest brother, John, in this family portrait. Now, this is when my mother's identity as an atomic bomb survivor converges with her being a pioneer. From 1947 to 1960, at least 50,000 Japanese women married American servicemen stationed in Japan. And my mother was one of them. Many of these women faced prejudice and discrimination in Japan, as well as in the United States. They were called Japanese war brides, but they never referred to themselves by that name. And my mother raised 4 children. I have 3 older brothers, and she raised us primarily by herself because my father's military duties often took him away from home, including a tour in Vietnam. But she always put family first. And my mother's immigration experience is part of the largest women-only immigration event in United States history. By 1960, these Japanese women had increased the Asian American population in the United States by 10%. They challenged immigration laws and enriched the cultural life in America. But at the same time, my mother's story is about cultural discontinuity, belonging, and identity. And here you see my mother's Japanese passport, the chrysanthemum um, symbol here on the cover. And then on this page here, you see that my mother's immigration status will be switching to permanent residency. And my mother kept her Japanese passport, I believe, as a connection to her homeland. Um, Now, when my mother became a United States citizen on July 31st, 1961, she was asked by the government official if she wanted to change her name to an American one. Now, my dad shared his opinion with her. He said, you know, you can do whatever you want to do, but here are my 2 cents. You were born Chiyono Shoji, and you should die Chiyono Shoji. And as you can see, my mother chose to keep her Japanese name, to keep her identity. She refused to be defined by someone else. Now, in 1958, my father received orders to transfer from Japan to Fort Knox, Kentucky, just outside of Louisville. And my mother left Japan, never to return. Now, after my father died in 2017, my brothers and I found a couple of items in his records, and we were very surprised by these 2 documents. After getting settled in Kentucky, my mother was interviewed by a local newspaper, the Shively newsletter. Shively is a suburb of Louisville, and it was for their Meet Your Neighbor column, right? Kind of a nice way of meeting people in your neighborhood or in the town. And I'll just go ahead and kind of run it by, just kind of read from it if it's too small for some of you to read. But in the first paragraph, it's the reporter introducing my mother, who says that she's the sweetest little Japanese lady you'll ever meet. She's a new neighbor of the neighborhood and thinks everyone is going out of their way to be nice to her. But the truth is, the reporter says they really enjoy having her as their guest and neighbor and feel it's a privilege to have her company. And then it goes into how she met my father, right? That falling in love just naturally happened. And then she speaks to the red tape that they had to plow through in order to be married. And then a little bit about what it was like to be married to an American serviceman, knowing that eventually she would have to leave Japan. And we also see that her father didn't want her to leave, wanting her to remain in Japan with him and her 2 sisters. But in that 1950s prose, we see that love won out as usual, and the happy young couple were married in November of 1955. That was incorrect. And then we learned that my middle brother Bill was born, and then what my mom thinks about America, and she thinks it's the most wonderful country in the world, but she misses Japan, she misses its gardens, as well as her family. And then at the very end, I assume that the reporter must have asked her about the atomic bomb because she responds that no one in the world has ever, or the reporter says, no one in the world has ever faced a more frightening experience. And my mother responds that she prays it will never happen again. And I believe as a result of that interview, my mother was asked to speak at the men's club of their church on this topic here. What was it like being on the receiving end of one of the first atomic bombs? A very difficult question for someone with trauma to try to address. Right. And if my mother had spoken at that event, my brothers and I, and my father, would have known about it. But we never knew anything about either of these two things. And if and so these artifacts really only raise more questions about her lived experiences. My mother's testimony of her war and bomb experiences was told to my father, brothers, and me in fragments, different stories at different times. There was no chronological order to them. And as a family, we respected her silence and didn't ask beyond what she was willing to share. Now, researchers and scientists still do not understand the long-term effects of high dose whole body radiation. I mean, we do know about high incidences of cancer as well as multiple types of cancer. And the Japanese Ministry of Health has come up with 11 different categories of health-related issues associated with radiation from the bomb. Now, my mother, who seldom ever suffered from the common cold, suffered from 7 of these different conditions, and those are highlighted in yellow. And it's very possible that 56 years after surviving the bomb eventually took her life. And second generation survivors like my brothers and myself, and third generation survivors like our children remain susceptible to its effects. You know, there are over 13,000 nuclear warheads in the arsenals of 9 countries. And these weapons are capable of destroying this planet 8 times over. And up to this point, right, the strategy of mutual assured destruction has worked, right, making us very complacent with our relationship to nuclear weapons. But systems can fail, right? There can be mechanical failure, there can be human error, and there is no shield that can protect us from these warheads. And for those who survive a nuclear attack, food, water, and air is contaminated. So it is essential that Nagasaki remain the last city terrorized by a nuclear weapon, and for the United States to be the first and only country to detonate nuclear weapons against innocent citizens. And thank you for your patience. And I have just a couple of more slides to show you. I thought you might be interested in seeing the companion piece to my wedding, to my mother's wedding portrait. So you see the companion piece on one side, and then the last formal photograph of my parents. Now, in 1955, my mother and father challenged the norms of what a married couple looked like. Their marriage formed a bridge between 2 countries, 2 languages, 2 cultures, 2 religions. And they made a pact shortly after they were married that they would have a 50-50 partnership, basically throwing out gender roles. And I can't emphasize how unusual that was in the 1950s for a Japanese couple or even an American couple. And I might venture to say that it's unusual for many couples today. But what wonderful role models they served for my brothers and myself as we entered into relationships with our partners. In closing, my mother's trauma prevented her from becoming an activist, right? She didn't make public pronouncements against war or nuclear weapons, Yet she believed in a peaceful world because she understood that war only results in suffering and harm. And despite the early circumstances of her life, she became a goodwill ambassador for the rest of it. And I always said that my mother's work was done at the individual level, where she formed relationships based on trust, respect, generosity, and forgiveness. And where my mother went, fellowship always followed her. Now, my mother wasn't impervious, but her lived life was a testament to the promise and to the wisdom of fall down 7 times, get up 8. And on behalf of her family, I thank you for honoring the memory of Chiyono Shoji Hamer with your presence this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan, so much for this incredibly informative and inspiring and moving. And I'm running out of words because I just love hearing your mother's story so much. And thank you for sharing her with us.
Thank
Um,
you.
to the audience, if you have questions for Susan, we have a few minutes for Q&A. So please ask your questions using the Q&A function in your Zoom window, and we will get to as many of them as we can. But to kick things off, can you tell us um, a little bit about how you came to learn your mother's story? That's, I know, with Holocaust survivor families, that's there are a lot of different ways that that played out, and I'd love for you to share
Oh,
your family's experience.
oh, for sure. Um, it's such a great question because I had a conversation with my oldest brother, John, a couple of years ago. And I asked him, how did we come to know that our mother was an atomic bomb survivor? And he said, it wasn't like our parents sat down with us and said, okay, something you should know. Your mother was an atomic bomb survivor. It didn't happen that way. Um, we kind of pieced things together. Like we knew my mother was from Nagasaki. We know that she was in Japan at the time of the war. And we also knew from school that there had been an atomic bomb. And we just put all of these pieces of the puzzle together. Right. And my mother, things would trigger her memory. Things would timing, I think, allowed her to share stories with us. So she may have shared a story with my brother, who then passed it on to the rest of us. She may have shared a story with me that I shared with the rest of them, right? And so the reason why I know so much about what happened on August the 9th is because I asked her directly. I wasn't going to, but a coworker of mine said, "Hey, with your mom being an atomic bomb survivor, has she ever told you about what happened that day?" And I said, "Oh, no, no. My mother doesn't want to share that information with us." And my friend said, "Well, it's really important that you know. So you should go home today and ask her." Right. And so I thought, well, I better go home and ask her. And so when I got home, I told her um, what my friend had said, and I asked her, "Can you share your story?" And my mother said yes, um, surprisingly. And we sat down. She and I sat down at the dining table. But I could see that my mother was going to a very deep place. Um, and she started to tell her story. And then she became extremely upset, especially when she reached the point of saying that she went to the city to find a friend. And that's basically where her story ended. That she was overwhelmed with emotion at that point. And that was the point where, you know, I didn't ask anymore. It was unfair to her to ask any more of her at that point.
Sure, thank you. Um, in the Q&A, we are getting lots of thanks and appreciation for you,
Oh,
in addition to questions, and I will get to them, but I want to just read a comment from Jamie Coker, who
yes,
says, I just wanted to say that I had the privilege of knowing Mrs. Hamer. She was such a sweet and loving lady. Miss her very much. So I wanted to make sure that you you knew that.
yes.
Um,
Jamie and I were best friends.
Amazing. It's wonderful that she's here with us. There are a few questions um, that touch on, you spoke a little bit about your mother's experiences with discrimination when she came to the US. There are a few folks who are wondering if you and your siblings in school or elsewhere experienced discrimination also.
Yeah, and that's another great question. Um, and yes, I'm not going to speak for my brothers. I'll just share my own experiences. Um, Up until third grade, I attended schools on military bases, right? And we came from all different sectors of life. Um, and it was, my schools were very diverse. And I don't, I would say that my first experience with discrimination came in the third grade when I first attended a public school. My father had retired and we bought a home off base, and I attended a public elementary school. And that's when I realized that my eyes really, the shape of my eyes singled me out, right? And I was the only Asian in the school. Um, but what was so different from the Department of Defense schools, which were also diverse, and my elementary school was extremely diverse as well, is that we there was already stratification by race as well as by income, right? And so groups of students um, uh, were grouped together by race and ethnicity or by income. And as I grew older, um, you know, I was made fun of, right? That I could not shield myself from my eyes, or there were microaggressions, right? And then uh, uh, this was the time when we had open borders with Mexico. And I remember going across the border with a friend who had blonde hair and blue eyes. And on our way back, we were asked if we were American citizens. And when we told the guard that we were, my friend said, "That's the first time I've ever been asked if I'm an American citizen." And so I'm sure that we were asked that question simply because of what I look like.
Thank you for sharing that.
Mhm.
Um, do you know if your father fully knew and understood your mother's experience? Do you know if she told him more than she told you and your siblings?
Oh, another great question. Um, he did not know more than we did. And in fact, shortly before he passed away, he had read a book by Susan Southard on Nagasaki. And it's one of the few books which highlights Nagasaki as a target for the atomic bomb. Sometimes Nagasaki takes a back seat to Hiroshima. And he read the book and he was very disturbed by it because of the personal stories that were shared. And he wrote me a note and he said, to please keep her memory alive, that he had no idea that it was as bad as the personal stories that were shared in the book. But he did not know any more than what we did.
Another comment to share with you from the Q&A. Your brother John is here on the webinar with us, and he said no question, but just sending a big hug and love from your brother.
Thank you.
So you mentioned that your mother never returned to Japan. Have you been back? Have your siblings? Did your father ever go back? And if so, what was that like?
Oh, no. My mother never returned. The only time that she said she wished she had gone back was when she was notified by her youngest sister, Amiko, that their father had died. And it was at the time that my father had been laid off from work. And my mother couldn't afford the plane fare to return to Japan for the funeral. And her sister, Amiko, her favorite sister, said, then my mother brought shame onto the family, and that she was as good as dead to the family at that point. And so, but my oldest brother, John, will be going to Japan next year, and I hope to go to Japan. It's on my bucket list, and I hope to do a lot more family research and then make a pilgrimage to Japan. Japan is very much like a stranger to me. But as I learn much more about my mother's story, it becomes a place that I've truly started to feel more connected to.
That's great. I hope you make it there soon.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
We have time for maybe one or two more quick questions. Your parents' partnership was very different from what we think of as married relationships in the 50s. There were a lot of things about their marriage that was what we would consider non-traditional. And the way that they sort of interacted and their true partnership was unusual for the time. Could you talk a little bit about whatever you might know about how they came to develop that relationship and that collaboration that they shared?
Yeah. Um, I growing up, um, my father did housework. We cleaned the house every week, and he would vacuum. He would do the laundry. He would cook Sunday breakfast. And in terms of yard work, we as a family would all, um, contribute to getting that work done. And so my mother was too small. My mother was only 4'10", so she was too small to push the mower. But she did other things outside, just an example of some of the gender roles that they threw out. And it was really remarkable. And I remember asking my dad, was your father like that? I mean, did you model behavior after your father? And he said, no, his father was a Chicago police officer. And so he was at work. His mother was a homemaker. And he said his father helped out where he could, but his mother was, primarily the keeper of the home. To be honest with you, I'm not really quite sure where my father learned that or where my mother decided to accept that role. Right.
Interesting. They were a very special pair, clearly.
Yes, yeah, and very progressive
Mhm.
for their time period.
Definitely,
Mhm.
definitely.
Yeah.
Um, just as we're about ready to wrap up, but just let me just check one more time. Um, are there any, you've shared so much with us about your mother and about your family. Are there any just final thoughts that you'd like to leave us with?
I think you might appreciate hearing this story. We live in such turbulent times and such divisive times. On August 15th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito made a public address on the radio, and he announced Japan's surrender. And this public address would have been the first time many Japanese would have heard his voice. So I thought, wow, what a momentous occasion. I wonder what effect this had on my mother. So I asked her, and I can still see her reaction. Right? She paused and she said, hearing his voice was meaningless. It had no meaning to her because all she could think about was peace. Right? And what a remarkable thing for a 9-year-old to think about, right? That even peace in the abstract held better outcomes than war. And considering these times and the conflicts going on in this world, maybe that's a nice way to end our afternoon together, is to remember those words she spoke.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And thank you for sharing again this incredible story. The love for you is pouring into the Q&A as we speak. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. This was definitely an hour well spent. And for those of you who are watching, you will be getting a link to a survey about today's program. Please fill that out. We'd love to hear your thoughts and hear about future programming. Susan, thank you again.
So
And everybody have a wonderful afternoon.